Now I will analyze this vision through the lens of the near-death experiences and between-life regression research. These are the books I used as part of my research. After by Dr. Bruce Greyson, based on 45 years of scientific research into near-death experiences and hundreds of case studies. Journey of Souls by Michael Newton, PhD. The book focuses on 29 cases, but often refers to as hundreds of cases over his 40 years of research. He pioneered the technique for between-life hypnosis. Between Death and Life by Dolores Cannon, based on 45 years of hypnotic research and hundreds of cases of between-life hypnosis. And The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot, who uses the theory that the universe is a hologram to explain the reports of near-death experiences and between-life regressions. So while doing this research, I focused on these points that are created by my third-person vantage of the afterlife. The higher self is an individuation of the God self, merged in the God field. It simultaneously exists outside time and space, yet uses time and space. It was not me, but the intuitive me fully personified. My awareness, the who I identify as, is a fragment of its awareness. It is the intelligent creator of my lives. And this is my whole big thing, when you find God in your heart, and we can define that as divinity, and we'll talk a bit about that. You find God in the physical world, in the manifested world here, you are effectively embodying the higher self, bringing more of it into the physical realm, which is the purpose of birthing into this realm. So here's a little descriptor to kind of, still move with that. The higher self creates the ethereal body. So the eternal light, the white light intelligent mass creates the ethereal body intelligently, which is then merged into the physical tissue body. So to start all this, when you spend time researching the paranormal in the afterlife, it becomes evident that by seeing patterns in their manifestations, humans are on the cusp of creating a new science. The paranormal in the afterlife easily could be considered dimensional interactions with a 3D hologram, the 3D world being ours. What will undoubtedly be created in the near future at the behest of understanding the phenomenon is a new science that includes the physics of the paranormal and the physics of the afterlife, just as I talked about in a video on my YouTube channel, Physics of the Paranormal. Scientists, when studying the phenomenon, are not being asked to disregard the old model of the physical universe. They just have to acknowledge that the old model is useful only under certain conditions. They must refine their old model to accommodate things like God, the afterlife, paranormal activity, to come up with a more complete description of reality. The first thing that fascinated me about researching near-death experiences was that the evidence became pretty conclusive. The brain is not the mind. This is reminiscent of what is in the Mystic book, and is right in line with Vedic philosophy as well too. Without having the brain, experiencers of NDEs were able to watch loved ones who are still alive, in some cases be able to communicate and interact with them, have physical-like sensations in the afterlife comparable to seeing and hearing, and still have emotions. So let's create some definitions. Feelings and thoughts are consciousness, while the mind is the sum total of all your conscious thoughts, feelings, desires, memories, hopes, etc. Your brain, on the other hand, is made up of nerve cells or neurons. We know that our minds and our brains are connected, but after thousands of years of personal observations and hundreds of years of research, we still don't know what exactly that connection is. The reason we still argue about the mind-brain question is that we still haven't come up with an answer that seems to work, at least not one that works all the time. We assume the mind, such as our consciousness, perception, thinking, memory, emotions, and intentions, are produced by electrical and chemical changes in the brain. In general, the evidence looks that way. Damage can occur to the brain and can impair us, and scientific experiments demonstrate that certain mental functions are associated with activity in specific parts of the brain. Yet associations between brain activity and mental function do not necessarily mean that the electrical activity in the brain caused the thought or feeling. Greyson, in his book, addresses Wildred Penfield, who devoted decades of pioneering research to mapping out the functions of the various parts of the brain by stimulating them with electrical currents. When I have caused a conscious patient to move his hand by applying an electrode to the motor cortex of one hemisphere, I've often asked him about it. Invariably, his response was, I didn't do that, you did. When I caused him to vocalize, he said, I didn't make that sound, you pulled it out of me. There is no place in the cerebral cortex where electrical stimulation will cause a patient to believe or to decide. So clearly, Penfield's patients could tell the difference between their own minds wanting their limbs to move and their brains making their limbs move. They were convinced that their brains and their minds were two different things. Scientists and philosophers agree that, as philosophers profess, the philosopher Professor Alva No put it, after decades of concerted effort on the part of neuroscientists, psychologists, and philosophers, only one proposition about how the brain makes us conscious, how it gives rise to sensation, feeling, subjectivity, has emerged unchallenged. We don't have a clue. Another way to think about the relationship between the brain and the mind is that the brain is a device for the mind to act effectively on the physical body, to focus our thoughts on the physical world. Your brain can receive thoughts from your mind, select the ones that are important for your survival, and convert them into electrical and chemical signals that your body can then understand. So this just kind of keeps moving forward, because what ended up being revealed is that the brain filters consciousness. NDEs reveal the brain filters consciousness. In Greyson's book, there are consistent reports of expanded senses. Suddenly, I could hear and see as never before. The sound of the waterfall was just so crisp and clear that it really is indescribable. 2 years before this, my right ear had been injured, but now, in my NDE, I could hear perfectly. And my sight was even more beautiful. I felt as if I had been limited by my physical senses all these years. Sights that were very far away from me were as clear as sights that were very close. And this was at the same time. There was no blurriness in my vision whatsoever. Flowers had colors that I'd never seen before, and I remember so well looking at them and thinking, I have never seen those colors before. Those in out of body experience extreme clarity and speed of thought. He writes, this is not what I would have expected of an experience that often occurs when the brain is deprived of oxygen. So I decided to look into the full range of thought processes that experiencers were describing to me. What I found is that many of them did report that their thoughts became much faster, clearer, and more logical than usual. I was aware of an enhanced state of consciousness in which my mind was extremely active and alert to what I was experiencing. I was very observant during this state, and my thoughts seemed to go almost twice the normal speed, although very clear in nature. The idea that the brain is a filter, limiting incoming information to what's important to our physical survival, should not be surprising. All of our senses filter out unimportant input. Our eyes not only transmit light to us, but also filter out ultraviolet and infrared light, so that we see only the small portion of light that it is in our visible range. Likewise, our ears not only receive sound vibrations, but filter out most of the sound frequencies that are important to dogs and cats, but not to us. So it is consistent with what we know of our neurobiology, that if our thoughts and feelings come from outside the body, the brain would act to filter out those that are not essential to our physical survival, just as other parts of our nervous system filter out non-essential information coming from the outside. So this implies that we have conditioned out our experience of our dimensionality because we don't believe it was relevant to our survival. This is something we would have done growing up as children, right? So now I'm going to compare the research in order that they occurred in my afterlife vision. So the vision starts with me witnessing my past life. Dr. Newton had an interesting observation with his research that matched my own experience. When I study the incarnation chronology of a client, I found there is usually a long span of hundreds of even thousands of years between their lives in Paleolithic nomadic cultures, with the introduction of agriculture and domestic animals in the Neolithic age, from 7,000 to 5,000 years ago. My subjects report living more frequent lives. Still, their lives are often spaced as much as 500 years apart. With the rise of cities, trade, and more available food, I see the incarnation schedules of souls increasing, with a growing population. Between 1000 and 1500 AD, my clients live an average of once in 2 centuries. After 1700, this changes to once in a century. By the 1900s, living more than one life in a century is common among my cases. That is exactly what I reported to you in the beginning. I have these broken memories, I can only assume spaced out because I have broken memories of those periods. And as I gain more awareness, as it comes closer to the present, I am definitely living, intermittently, but definitely every, if not 100 years, every other couple 100 years. And then we're coming closer to the 20th century, I'm definitely living every 100 years. And in this life, I definitely have 2 lives in this century. Or, well, I was born in the last century. So, which is the same life that the World War II occurred in. So that's just very, very consistent with my own experience. I found that to be fascinating. And an overarching theory that I have that souls are, we're trying to replicate our experience, our soul's nature. And the more that we have an environment or environments that support that, the more souls want to actually embody in the physical world. But that's for something else. More than half of those who had NDEs said that after death, we review our lives and judge ourselves. And in some form, we have to face the consequences of the things we did. So, something that is interesting about the afterlife vision that I experienced was that I didn't witness a life review. In Michael Newton's research, he found that older souls, those who have had more time on Earth in the birth and death life cycle, experience life reviews less frequently. That's interestingly consistent with me having memories of having been on Earth in ancient times, which at least means I have been reincarnating for tens of thousands, if not longer years. Still, the physics of life reviews are fascinating, and there are some points worth mentioning. Life reviews are instantaneous. It is paradoxically at once both incredibly rapid and yet slow enough to witness in detail. It is the ability to simultaneously comprehend the whole and every part. They are not in first person, but third person. I watched me mowing the lawn from straight above, anywhere from several hundred to a couple thousand feet, as though I were a camera. That's interestingly consistent with my afterlife vision, where I'm in third person. So, very interesting. Past events are experienced as if they are happening in the present, with all the original sensations and feelings. Many events which had been long forgotten crowd into my imagination with the character of recent familiarity. That's what I experienced when I witnessed, as a 16-year-old, I'm witnessing my past life. And I'm saying, I'm alive. I'm actually saying it because I feel like it's a present moment experience simultaneously combined with a sensation that it was the past. So I had this weird bridging of time thing going on. They experience a heightened state of observation, taking in more than the individual did at the time. I relived every exact thought and attitude, even the air temperature and things that I couldn't have possibly measured when I was 8 years old. For example, at the time, I wasn't aware of how many mosquitoes were in the area. In the life review, I could have counted the mosquitoes. Everything was more accurate than could possibly be perceived in the reality of the original event. I experienced things that cannot be perceived. And more than half experienced those past events not only through their own eyes, but also from the viewpoints of others, feeling those other people's emotions as well as their own. Scenes incorporate a full unity experience with details about all participants' lives and perspectives. Tom relived his entire life, not only through his own eyes, but also from the perspective of other people. What I'm telling you is, I was in my Aunt Gay's body. I was in her eyes. I was in her emotions. I was in her unanswered questions. I experienced the disappointment, the humiliation. It was very devastating to me. I received all information about every scene, my perceptions and feelings, and everyone else's perceptions and feelings who were in the scene. There was no good and no bad. There was only me and my loved ones from this life trying to be or just trying to survive. And life reviews are non judgmental, with the only one doing so is yourself. I was able to observe the scene absolutely, positively, unconditionally. I experienced it with this unconditional love that is God's eyes, or the eyes of Jesus Christ, or the light of Jesus, or the light of Buddha, enlightened, the spiritual entity. No judgmental aspect whatsoever. This is simultaneously with the total devastation of what I created in my aunt's life, and the arrogance, the snide little thoughts, the bad feelings, and the excitement of what I created in my own life at that young age. This total lack of cosmic judgment and or any divine system of punishment and reward has been and continues to be one of the most controversial aspects of the NDEs among religious groups, but it is one of the most often reported features of the experience. What is the explanation? We live in a universe that is far more benevolent than we realize. I repeat, we live in a universe that is far more benevolent than we realize. So, a unity perspective that changes the attitude about painful moments, yet viewed objectively with unconditional love. So, there's a story I'd like to relay from Dr. Greyson's book, After, which I feel is very important for us to understand the mystery of the afterlife. My mother had been dependent on drugs, angry, and abusive. I saw all of this childhood trauma again in my life review, but I didn't see it in little tidbits and pieces, the way I had remembered it as an adult. I saw and experienced it just as I had lived it at the time it first happened. Not only was I me, I was also my mother, and my dad, and my brother. We were all one. I now felt my mother's pain and neglect from her childhood. She wasn't trying to be mean. She didn't know how to be loving or kind. She didn't know how to love. She didn't understand what life is really all about. And she was still angry, and from her own childhood, angry because they were poor and because her father had left her. Everything came flooding back. I witnessed my brother's rage at my mother's abuse, and then this turning around and giving it to me. I saw how we were all interconnected in this dance that started with my mother. I could now feel that she abused me because she hated herself. I suddenly knew that my mother had had the same thing happen to her in her childhood. As my life review continued, I also saw my mother's soul, how painful her life was, how lost she was. In my life review, I saw she was a good person and caught in helplessness. I saw her beauty, her humanity, and her needs that had gone unattended to in her own childhood. I loved her and understood her. We may have been trapped, but we were still souls connected in our dance of life by an energy source that had created us. The life review incorporates a unity perspective that changes the attitude about painful moments, yet viewed objectively with unconditional love. So, is my personal theory that we experience a life review because we are about to merge with the higher self. I presume it is a rectification of our awareness, which is but a fragment of the higher self's awareness, snapping it back into its original state as it merges. It becomes aware of the unity perspective as its mind or awareness is transferred over to that of the higher self. But that last piece, I'll talk a bit more about that because it's one of the takeaways. The idea that all the painful events that can happen to you in your life, you can there will be a time with which you will be able to understand why the perpetrator of that painful event occurred and why they did what they did, why they behaved the way they did, and their entire frame of reference of reality. And I find focusing on that to be a very powerful, powerful way of healing pain. So I'll talk a bit about that later. So in my research, I didn't find any specific references to an actual boundary that separates Earth from the afterlife realm, like I had witnessed. Though there are some peripheral references. In Newton's research, he found some travel high above the Earth before they enter the tunnel of light. In Dolores Cannon's work, she notes, many subjects describe the experience after leaving the physical body as journeying towards a bright, dazzling light at the end of a tunnel. One of my subjects said that this white light was an intense energy field that served as the barrier between our physical world and the spiritual realm. Other than those, there was no other reference to an actual barrier between the two realms. However, on several different experiencer forums, experiencers of alien contact, I have found people who have witnessed what I have, a barrier between the Earth and the afterlife realm, and these people's astral travels or their connections or their remote viewings. Is this something I have the advantage of seeing because I had a third person perspective? I'm not really clear. So that's just a very fascinating piece. The afterlife is social. Most people who are able to tell me about having freedom of movement and going to open spaces where souls of many learning levels gather in a recreational atmosphere. People witness. So when it comes to what I witnessed occurs in the afterlife, I found many similarities with the research. I reported the afterlife was social, and that is exactly how others describe it. In these communal areas, floating souls socially engage in many activities. People also witness structures in the afterlife, just as I saw. Those who visit them universally report seeing many vast and celestial beautiful cities. All describe these mysterious metropolises with remarkable consistency. The 12th century Sufis were so familiar with them that they even gave them several names. They even gave several of them names. In my afterlife vision, I saw that the nature of the universe was layers of lands, layers in inner dimensions stacked on top of one another. While it appears in between life regressions, they were very common to witness. It's layered, The levels of light are all woven together. I see variations in thickness and color, refraction in the layers. The different planes occupy the same space. It is here at the same location of the Earth. It is just a different frequency. The vibrations occupy the same space at the same time, but it is on different frequencies, and you adjust the frequency receiver to receive a particular set of vibrations. These different planes exist at the same time, but they are on different frequencies, so they do not collide, so to speak. With subjects who speak about spiritual layering, I mentioned the possibility that they could be seeing the astral planes. On metaphysical writing, we read a lot about planes above the earth, beginning with the Vedas, followed by later Eastern texts. Astral planes have historically represented a series of rising dimensions above the physical or tangible worlds, which blend into the spiritual. Astral planes also have been described as being less dense as one moves further away from the heavy influences of Earth. Fascinatingly, just like myself, many experience their own higher selves to have an ability to create multiple offshoots of awareness. Michael Newton, in his research, found that his clients were reporting a soul that creates multiple lives simultaneously. Many people feel the idea of souls having the capacity to divide in the spirit world is against all their preconceptions of a singular individualized spirit. I confess that I too felt uncomfortable the first time a client told me about having parallel lives. I can understand why some people find the concept of soul duality perplexing, especially when faced with the further proposition that one soul may even be capable of living in different dimensions during the same relative life. In line with Newton's research, I am aware that I also have another life simultaneously living in another part of the world. It's a he. I know where he is. He's having tuned into his family dynamics, and he is in a much more unstable country with which I have had synchronicities with regarding what it's like to live there, as well as with geopolitical disturbances that occur in that country. One of the most fascinating and surprising collaborations with my afterlife vision wasn't just that so many people reported planning their next physical incarnation while in the afterlife realm, but that when doing so, focused on not physical human groupings, such as families, but what Newton termed soul groups, those who would help impact and develop your soul. I explicitly witnessed a grid that contained soul groups. Now, my higher self was using a version that was tracking gray alien DNA in the population, but nonetheless, the description is similar. It was so common amongst Newton's patients, he was able to create an organization around it. He describes what he calls spiritual ponds, like lily pads in a pond, within which are an outer secondary grouping, which consists of roughly all the souls that you would interact with in your life, with overlaps occurring with other secondary groups. Then there is an inner group. He describes it as the small primary clusters vary in number, containing anywhere from 3 to 25 souls. These are intimate old friends who have about the same awareness level, are closely united for all eternity. They choose lives together as relatives and close friends during their incarnations on Earth. They have direct and frequent contact, such as we would see in a human family, and have a sensitivity to each other that is beyond our conception on Earth. Secondary groups of souls are arranged in the form of a community support group, which is much less intimate with one another. An example would be a high school classmate who was once a close friend, but who you now see only at class reunions. Larger secondary groups of entities are made up of giant sets of primary clusters as lily pads in one pond. Spiritual ponds appear to be endless within these ponds. I've never heard of a secondary group estimated at less than 1,000 souls. So what the above leads us to conclude is that we create our lives. I have said souls do have the freedom to choose when, where, and who they want to be in their physical lives. Now, I've always believed this, but it's fascinating that it actually is some research that supports this perspective. And from Newton's analysis, we create everything. And I believe that too. Our parents, our gender, our birth location, our physical limitations, our perceived character flaws. We may even create our death. This is Praginam Brahma, a Vedic chant, a Vedic mantra that I would use. And it does say consciousness is the creator. I just want to emphasize that my story, The Rising, is about visioning. And that's what seems to be said here, that we are creators. The universe is a quantum hologram with non-locality at its fundamental level. You can vision a future moment in the timelessness state within, and the universe can respond. It appears what's being said is there may be stages or levels of creation. So this is my own kind of personal theory, but something is being said about the nature of creation and the human ability to create. And so I come up with this kind of quick analysis here that seems pertinent to my own experience of creating. That there's a personal level, one that has to deal with objects or circumstances, maybe a partner you want to change, or a job you want to change, or want to get a new car. And you can vision those things. You can literally vision them and manifest them. And then there seems to be this other version of creation, kind of like a life holistic, where events are planned or created before your birth, which can manifest as circumstances of your upbringing and points of life achievements. And I found that to be very interesting. And then there seems to be, this is my general theory, nothing was talked about it here, but that I believe there's a collective creation going on here. I think that's what actually holds the simulation in place, is that we are all believing it to be existing in a certain state, and it actually manifests that way. And that can be expressed as a collective zeitgeist. And there are definitely collective manifestations that occur. So I believe that that some degree that these are actually all very real, and that you can interact with these. So basically, yeah, coming to the full circle, being placed in the womb, I just found this interesting. Both Michael Newton and Dolores Cannon's research found spirits merge with the baby just after birth, during birth, or sometimes just before, and that the process is very conscious for the spirit. The spirit can even hover around until it determines it wants to merge with the baby's mind. And I just thought that was an interesting feature that both those books kind of point to. And lastly, there wasn't really any good answers for why we have amnesia. And I have my own theories about some of this stuff. First off, you might not like who you were. And you might have a kind of more innocent soul, if you will. And then as the life circumstances in that maybe medieval times or whenever you existed, created a you that you might not like. And it's a really good opportunity to create something new. An example is I would have had a very different life had I been aware I was of the tragedy that happened to me in the Holocaust. I would have not lived the life I'd lived, and you would end up focusing on it as maybe something to rectify or trying to heal. And that is not what the purpose of this existence was. So it's very clear that it's a new slate to create something new. You may have imprints left over, but there's something new to create. And I believe that that's kind of in part what's going on. But I think most people sometimes don't expect this one. The whole point I like making with the mind, that the brain is not the mind, and the mind is filtered by the brain, and that when it's released from it, there's a grander experience of awareness, that there actually might be an effect, a dimensional physics effect of moving through dimensional fields, and that you actually just lose the memory because you're in a different dimensional state than you are when you're preborn. So yeah, those are some of my kind of thoughts behind that.